Okay, welcome back. So we're going to finish up chapter 24 here. And so what we're going to talk about a little bit is some keys in the Earth's history. Origin of the Earth, 4.6 billion years to the present. So about the first single-celled life, which is the first life. The first youths. The origin of multicellularity. Sorry, my writing is. What we call explosion and the colonization. Okay, so talk about first single-celled organisms. So the oldest fossils known are 3.5 billion years old. So 3.5 billion years ago, old called stromatolites. Stromatolite is a rock composed of layers. Bacteria, sediment that are kind of layered on top. So on the top layer is where you'd have the living, and we still have some of these existing in sort of bays, I believe in Australia. And this is a fossilized stromatolite. What happened is in these layers sandwiched in between are fossilized cyanobacteria 3.5 billion years ago, date on our first life. So let's also talk about origin of eukaryotic cells. Big deal. Now the dates here are going to be, most dates say 1.5 go for our first eukaryotic cells. There are some references that go back a little further. So we don't have certainty until 2.1 billion years ago. We can use the 1.5 billion reference. So here is eukaryotic cell process in which it started to nuclear envelope around its DNA, started to develop things like an endoreticulatum and cytoskeleton, and about we'll have a whole chapter of eukaryotic cells, and we'll talk about what happened in a little more detail there. Process that happened that I want you to this chapter is a process called endosymbiosis. Led to the origin of the mitochondria and chloroplast within the eukaryotic cell. This theory of endosymbiosis suggests that mitochondria and chloroplasts were free-living eukaryotic cells that were engulfed within a larger cell, or engulfed by a larger cell. Probably because the host cell wanted to eat it. But what happened was that chloroplast got in there, it probably started out as a free-living cell, and when it was inside that larger host, it gave that host the benefit of photosynthesis. And so in digesting and destroying it, it stayed the host cell, and eventually, over time, became the organelle known as the chloroplast. Similar taking in a bacteria capable of using oxygen to make ATP efficiently, and letting it live within it rather than is probably what led to the origin of mitochondria. That's the endosymbiotic theory. About multicellularity. So the oldest known of multicellular are relatively small algae that lived about 1 million years ago. And during the time frame of 1 go to about 575 million years ago, multicellular organisms were very limited in size and diversity. Meaning that they were not large and they were not very diverse. Thought that life was pretty much limited to being, near hot or near the equator, places where it was a little bit was so cold in most places. Larger, more diverse multicellular appearing in the fossil record until 175 million years. Which brings us to the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion, not an actual explosion as such. What it is an explosion of diversity. So it's a good explosion. So this was about 575 million ago. We suddenly many of animals appearing in the fossil. Just we had this massive adaptive that we call the Cambrian explosion. Suddenly we were seeing organisms we had seen before, such as echinoderms, brachiopods, arthropods, and other groups such as the sponge and the cnidarians that were already present during this time as well. And by the way, we will be talking about throughout the semester. So, and if you look at probably some of these look a little familiar to you. All of these started to appear during the Cambrian. Another important thing that happened in the Cambrian is we started to see adaptations that suggest predator-prey relationship, and we have been part of what collective radiation. So prior to the Cambrian, there was little to no evidence of predation. Most things were, or eating algae or things like that. But during the explosion, became common in large organisms. And we started a lot of different adaptations in the fossil record for a predatory lifestyle, such as claws, teeth, appendages. In the prey, we saw adaptations such as hard shells, attack them, sharp spines, to also serve as camouflage. And this evolutionary arms race, right? The predator evolves claws, the prey evolves a hard shell. So the predator's claws that can get through the shell, so the prey evolves, this sort of arms race back is part of what contributed that adaptive radiation, because as organisms diversified to kind of for this arms race, they started to splinter off in different lineages. So finally, I want colonization of land. So eukaryotes had a big head start. So the cyanobacteria land about 1 billion years. For some other organisms like ants, fungi, the dates are approximately 365 million ago. Again, there's a lot of variation here depending on plant species we're talking about. Animal groups such as arthropods about 4 million years ago. Are amphibians about 365 million years ago. The amphibians are the tetrapods. They rise to all the other tetrapods like us. Amphibians evolved from fin fishes. So this evolutionary transition was associated with adaptations that allowed organisms to make their way on land. For example, if we're a lobe-finned fish, really important adaptation was the of bones that could connect on land, and also very development of lungs that could take in from the atmosphere rather than gills that would take in dissolved oxygen from the water. We will talk a lot about this when we talk about the evolution of animal groups. In general, evolutionary transition to land required lots of adaptations that would also allow prevent desiccation and to get water, right? Because if you're you don't have to worry about those two things. By water, you can constantly get water, and you don't dry. All of a sudden, if you're on land, not only can out, but you also need some way to get water. So you need to be able to reproduce on land, right? You don't have the water to move your gametes around. So plants give us an excellent example of some of these adaptations. So plants evolved when they came to land a vascular system, which you see in blue, and is essentially like a net pipes that could pull water from the ground up through the plant, so the plant can. And plants also use waxy waterproof coating to prevent or slow water. And there's tons of adaptations. Plants also evolved things like pollen to allow it to them to reproduce on land. And we'll talk about the major groups in this chapter. A lot about different adaptations. This final slide, I realize, is a bit of a doozy. I just wanted to, I've mentioned a few dates that you should know. And I thought it would be useful to put them all on one slide so you don't have to kind of phase them out. These are the that I might actually ask you about. Okay, you need to know the names and order of the names and order of the eras, and then the special dates where some important things happen. Disclaimer, lots more important things than this, but we can only focus on. So these are the things that we are on in terms of actually knowing the date. Right, that's it. As usual, questions, I'll see you in lab.